The following program is brought to you in living color on NBC.
And let me submit to you that the real group that's on challenge in this country as a result of the extreme right is not the liberals. I mean, the liberals will always be attacked by them. And I think as a liberal, I'm entitled to say this. But what's really being destroyed in our country at this time is the respectable, constructive voice of conservatism at a time when we need that voice as articulately expressed as possible. I happen to believe that a part of the elements of great strength in our system has been the substantive give and take between true liberalism on the one hand and true conservatism on the other. And neither one of those groups could ever profess to having monopoly on all of the right answers. That both made contributions at regular intervals in our history. The simplest illustration I can think of is that the liberals wrote the Declaration of Independence. The conservatives would have remained with the British, presumably, the rest of their days. But the conservatives wrote the Constitution. The liberals would have nothing to do with it. In fact, they boycotted the convention. It took both to make their contribution at their time. And ever since then in our country's history, constructive and positive liberalism and constructive and positive conservatism have been the warp and woof of what we mean by the American way of life.
We call this program Politics the Outer Fringe. We do not call it Politics the Lunatic Fringe. There is a tendency to characterize the less orthodox groups in that way, partly because this country has operated under a two-party system for so long that anything outside of it seems not quite right. But unorthodox political thinking is not necessarily wild or erratic thinking, or in itself reprehensible. It may be. It doesn't have to be. There are nobody knows how many fringe or extremist groups in this country, and obviously we cannot deal with all of them. They cover quite a range. On the right, for example, there is the Christian Crusade of Dr. Billy James Hargis, which put out this pamphlet called Communism, Hypnotism, and the Beatles. It maintains that there is a communist master music plan designed to corrupt all age brackets of American youth, beginning with babies and 1- and 2-year-olds. Or there is the John Birch Society, with its publication, American Opinion. Or on the left, the W.E.B. Du Bois Clubs of America, named for an American Negro who in late years became a communist. Or Viet Report, which is a bi-monthly publication devoted to opposing the American position on the war in Vietnam. Stoughton Lin, the Yale professor who recently went to North Vietnam, has a hand in that. Some of the groups you'll hear about during this hour may seem to you to deserve the epithet lunatic or to need government action and silencing. The urge to silence somebody usually is dangerous and should be resisted, but you can judge that for yourself as we go along. To continue, this handbill was put out by an organization called the Ad Hoc Committee for the May 17th demonstration. Its purpose was to stage a demonstration in Chicago on May 17th when President Johnson was speaking there. Chicago is a favorite haunt of the so-called New Left, but that city has always had a tradition of dissent. Prime movers in the demonstration were members of Students for a Democratic Society. Steve Baum, a regional director of SDS, led the planning.
The protests of May 17th against President Johnson will take place in Chicago. All the SDS chapters are going to be there from the different universities and communities. The demonstration is a joint demonstration between the civil rights groups and the anti-war groups in Chicago. One of the important things that we'll have to consider from all the SDS chapters is that we have to make up signs for this demonstration. I think it's going to be very important, the type of signs that we have, so that we can relate to people that are walking by and to other people that are on the line and to people that may see us on television. So I think it would be a good idea if we found a place to where we could make signs at this time. Does anybody have any ideas where we could go to make signs?
Well, we could use the Guild Coffee House. It's sort of the clubhouse of Northside SDS, and we were planning on having some sort of poster party too. We could have it for the whole region there.
So, on to the poster painting party. Surprisingly large numbers of young people find this a rewarding way to spend some time. SDS, for example, which is a prime picketing and poster-carrying organization wherever it exists, claims chapters on 63 campuses. Non-communist left organizations like SDS are usually overwhelmingly interested in two subjects. One is civil rights, and in connection with that, SDS argues that the campaign against poverty should be run by the poor themselves. The other is the subject of this demonstration, the Vietnam War, which they oppose. When President Johnson decided to go to Chicago to make a speech about that war, it gave SDS a made-to-order opportunity. That is where their headquarters happened to be. And so, the night of the president's speech in the Hilton Hotel, SDS pickets were on the march outside.
I ask you and I ask every American to put our country first if we want to keep it first. Put away all the childish, divisive things if you want the maturity and the unity that is the mortar of a nation's greatness. I do not believe that those men who are out there fighting for us tonight think that we should enjoy the luxury of fighting each other back home. We do not seek to enlarge this war, but we shall not run out of it. There will be some nervous Nellies, and some who will become frustrated and bothered and break ranks under the strain. And some will turn on their leaders and on their country and on our own fighting men. There will be times of trial and tension in the days ahead that will exact the best that is in all of us. But I have not the slightest doubt that the courage and the dedication and the good sense of the wise American people will ultimately prevail.
Carl Oglesby of Ann Arbor, Michigan, 30 years old, gave up a well-paid job in industry to head up SDS. He's a key spokesman for the New Left. He discussed SDS with Bill Matney of NBC News.
It's proper to think of SDS as radicals. We think that anybody who's committed to democracy in this country now is a radical, because democracy is a radical idea here. But beyond that, there's great hesitation in SDS about being ideologically certain about anything. I mean, nobody draws up a blueprint about what the good society is going to look like and then tries to sell that blueprint to others. We start with a very humble observation. The humble observation is that people don't have power. We start with a very humble kind of faith, that if the people do have power, then what we don't like about this country's conduct will be changed. If the people had power in the South, racism would long since have begun to disappear. If the people had power in the conduct of foreign affairs, the Vietnam business would never have grown so big. Maybe the war would never even have taken place. And the people don't have power. And consequently, the country is getting itself into some trouble now. Power is centralized. Power increasingly is in the hands of a very few people. Not that there's a conspiracy going on, but it's nevertheless the case. Just hard facts tell you about it, that fewer and fewer people have more and more power in determining what's going to happen to this country. Now, they have that power, it seems to me, because the democratic process has broken down. The parties have essentially become the collaborationists, or become the collaborators with one another. There's no fundamental difference of opinion when you try to describe the center of the Democratic Party as compared with the center of the Republican Party. Both are fundamentally committed to a style of organizing the domestic society. Both are fundamentally committed to certain presuppositions about the Cold War, committed to the spread around the world of the American way of life, committed to the modern version of the open door foreign policy. Now, when you have that condition, you have essentially a one-party state. And I think that describes maybe one of the reasons why we think that that a new kind of radical breaking away has to happen, that the other alternatives to the organizing of society have to be named and stipulated and argued for in the marketplace. It would be silly for anybody in the New Left to deny, for example, the fact that the experience of the Beat generation has had a great deal to do with a spirit in this movement, a sense of freedom from class mores, a sense of experimental attitudes towards living. That has a lot to do with both the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and with SDS too. The feeling of community is important here. We want to talk about community in ways in which most of the old leftists didn't think so important. Maybe you can see some of the contradictions in the fact that the chairman of SDS at one university is also the chairman of the Young Conservatives Club. And an important conservative intellectual has just not long ago written an article saying that the New Left really has inherited the individualist ethic of the old right. Paul Goodman talks about the New Left in a very warm and affectionate way, but says that the trouble with it is that it calls itself leftist instead of rightist. If they were really facing the implications of what they said about the importance of individuals, then they would call themselves the New Right.
If you move left from SDS, you come to the Du Bois Clubs of America, recently designated by the Attorney General as a Communist Front organization. The Du Bois Clubs are not to be confused with the Boys Clubs of America. The Du Bois Clubs have about 50 chapters and 2,000 members. Their national director is Hugh Fowler, 21 years old.
In many ways, Attorney General Katzenbach's attack on the Du Bois Club in petitioning the SACB to investigate us as a communist front has served only to strengthen our movement. In specific ways, in terms of membership, we've gained about 700 members in the past month or 2 months since the attack. And I think that the real reason for the Attorney General's attack on the Du Bois Clubs is not that he thinks any of the charges made against us are true, but rather that he would like to use this attack as kind of an opening wedge into attacking the movement in America and the movement statements about his lack of decision on implementing the Civil Rights Act, and also the criticism of his Vietnam policies. And President Johnson wants to stifle this discussion. He wants to stifle this criticism, and therefore he has instructed his Attorney General to attack us, and thereby to give to all Americans a kind of notice that if they speak out against the Vietnamese War, or if they speak out against President Johnson's non-implementation of the Civil Rights Act, that they will come under such criticism also. And I think that this attack is to stifle not only the Du Bois Clubs, but all Americans' right to dissent in this country.
The old left, led by the American communists, is associated with Moscow's policy of coexistence. The new left is considered Peking-oriented. Prominent and militant in the new left is the Progressive Labor Party, its members accused of encouraging the Harlem riots and taking illegal trips to Cuba. Philip Abbott Luce was an enthusiastic member, but he broke away and wrote an expose of the PLP. Today he lives by farming and writing. NBC News correspondent Herbert Kaplow asked Luce why he quit.
Well, for me, there was no Hungary, and so there wasn't a specific event that simply broke me out. There was a number of things. The longer I was in the movement, the more I discovered that I was involved in something that I couldn't personally countenance. Acts of violence, the possibility of going underground, and at a certain point I was told that if you got involved in the underground movement enough, there was no return. It was something I couldn't bring myself to do. I just couldn't stand to see the young people that I had helped to bring into the movement, plus other young people, involved in actions which they had no control over. And the fact that at some point in the future they might be either arrested, lose the chance of making a livelihood, or, in fact, come to some kind of physical harm as a result of actions and programs which we as leaders had promulgated and which they had no knowledge of. It was also the fact, of course, that there was a difference in the whole concept, the philosophy of the freedom that the progressive labor leaders envisioned and that freedom which I believed in. This included the fact that if they took power, of course, they would abolish freedom of speech, plus the fact that there were more and more restrictions on the membership, not to be seen with such and such a person, not to do such and such a thing, not to dress as we were dressing, not to have mustaches or sideburns or beards or anything like that. It's really the difference between rebellion and revolution, in part. And it seemed to me at that point that I was more of a rebel than a revolutionary, and that I couldn't go along with it, so I left.
Do you consider elements of the old and or the new left dangerous?
Well, I think that they're dangerous, yes. I think that the danger can be overplayed. I think the danger from the new left resides in groups like Progressive Labor, which are intent on creating violence at this point in history. The danger from the old left, the Communist Party of the United States, is more a long-run danger, when they would attempt to create a long period of chaos and anarchy in the country and confusion, wherein at a certain point in a number of years at least, they would then think they were strong enough to attempt either a coup or have infiltrated the government or something to the point where they thought they could take it over. I think there's a real difference in orientation between the old left and the new left, and I think the old left represents a long-run danger. The new left represents a short-run danger.
How successful has the Progressive Labor Party in achieving its goals?
Well, it's been relatively unsuccessful, as have all communist groups in the United States. The membership of Progressive Labor is basically small, perhaps at the most 1,500 members. But the fact that they only have a few members doesn't mean that they're any less militant. And the danger that comes from Progressive Labor or the May 2nd movement or any of the front groups of Progressive Labor is not that the American government is about to be toppled. The danger that I see in it is the fact that they're involving a number of younger people in a movement, in an ideology that in many cases the young person doesn't understand, doesn't completely ascribe himself to, or in fact has no knowledge of. And these young people will be the ones that will suffer in the long run. And it seems to me that the danger from Progressive Labor or any of these radical ultra-left groups resides in the fact that they are enticing or gaining young people into their ranks, and these young people will be the ones that will suffer in the future.
Mr. Luce, a lot of people who break away from what might be considered these extreme left-wing groups swing as far over to the right.
That's true. That's because I think that they're basically totalitarian-minded in the first place, and that they need the control exhibited by either the far right or the far left. I think that I rebelled from the far left in part simply because of my dislike for the totalitarian nature of the organizations. And I'm certainly not about to align myself with the far right.
In some strange way, the Communist Party of the United States has recently become almost sedate. At any rate, it tries to be. It tries to give a new impression of sweet reasonableness, solid Americanness, and settled wisdom. This may be because it was getting nowhere giving its old impression. Gus Hall is the leader of the CP USA New Style. I spoke to him at party headquarters in downtown New York. Mr. Hall, what are the current goals of the Communist Party of the United States?
As far as the immediate goals are concerned, of course, we're involved and interested in especially in the struggle for world peace, in the struggle to make it possible for all nations to really have a right to self-determination, and of course, struggle in the field of civil liberties and civil rights, and problems of automation, the technological problem.
Well, let's say we all accept that, but what do you have in mind for the short term?
Well, I think the thing that has to be resolved above anything else is to end the U.S. aggression in Vietnam. I think this is not only wrong and unjust, but it's an example of the kind of thing that we now must find ways of avoiding. That is that the Vietnamese should have a full right to determine for themselves what kind of a government they want and how they want it and how they want to run it, without any interference from the United States or anybody else.
You think, in short, the United States should withdraw from Vietnam?
Yes, I think we should find the path for withdrawal, a retreat and a withdrawal, and finally to get out of there completely.
Mr. Hall, have the goals, the principles of the Communist Party of the United States changed over the years?
Well, of course there's change, and it will continue to change to reflect the changing conditions and changing problems that we face. But I would say above that, speaking more historically, that the party has changed in the sense that it more realistically now reflects reality, American reality. Therefore, it more realistically reflects tactical problems that are reflective of the problems in the United States. And in this sense, I think we have become a more mature Marxist party. I think we view this social science now in a more scientific manner.
Mr. Hall, a number of the right-wing organizations claim that they exist because of the Communist Party to keep the country from falling into the hands of communism. What is your view of the right-wing organizations?
Well, fundamentally, the right-wing organizations are anti-democratic, and what they really want to do away with is the democratic processes that take place in this country.
You said, Mr. Hall, that the right-wing organizations really want to destroy the democratic processes. But isn't that a fact that wherever communism has taken over, democratic processes have been destroyed, they've been finished?
Well, I wouldn't say they're finished. I think there are certain problems, and I very frankly state that the socialist countries have not yet resolved the problems of popular participation fully, the democratic processes fully. I think they're moving in that direction. I think the steps are in the right direction, but they have not resolved.
But how would you expect the American people to confide their destinies to you if the communist experience in other countries indicated that such democratic freedoms as they have were going to be destroyed?
Well, it has no. It really has no relationship of what happens in these other countries, because each of these countries have their own traditions, their own history. For instance, whether you take Russia or China and so on, socialism came into existence in these countries without any background of democratic existence. We, on the other hand, state very frankly that socialism in the United States will be a reflection of our experience, our level of industrial development, and therefore it will reflect the democratic experience of our people and our country. For instance, for that reason, we state very frankly, even now, that we do not see socialism either coming into being or being built by a one-party system. I think there is a very strong rising interest in socialism, and when we appear, whether in campuses or otherwise, the audiences would indicate that there's a tremendous interest in socialism as a solution. I wouldn't say that it has yet reached a point where it's committed to it, but interest, and it wants to probe and study it. And this is really, I think, the biggest single thing in American politics in the last years, is this tremendous interest in socialism as one of the possible solutions to the problems of the world.
On the outer fringe of American politics, there is an enormous amount of propagandizing. Millions of dollars are spent to spread the printed word. Nobody knows how many millions. Radio also is a frequently used tool of the extremists, primarily those of the right wing. Television is less frequently employed. The telephone has been brought into play to disseminate right-wing messages to some 100,000 callers a day in more than 100 communities in 28 states and the District of Columbia. The program is called Let Freedom Ring, but critics use unkinder phrases. Dial a hate, dial a smear, or dial a diatribe. The system used is simplicity itself. You pick up the phone, dial a special number, and you get a recorded message.
Let freedom ring. The communist conspiracy, strange as it may at first seem, is very interested in the American mental health movement. They want to convince the American people that anyone who is patriotic and anti-communist is a little crazy and possibly dangerous. How do these modern arbiters of what is mentally healthy think? One of the leaders in this brave new world said recently that a steady decline in the dominance of religion would be good for the human race. That is how they are going to make you more healthy mentally, at least in their eyes, although your minister may not agree.
We urge our listeners, especially those involved in mental health on the local level, to send 25 cents in coin for further documentation on the subversive nature of the mental health movement. Needless to say, the leaders in the mental health movement have been rather unhappy with this series, but we feel that these are facts, and they're all facts, that need to be brought out to the American people so they can judge for themselves whether this movement is really going to do anything for the health of America.
Let Freedom Ring, which is headquartered in Sarasota, Florida, describes itself as a non-profit corporation disseminating anti-communist, anti-socialist, pro-American messages via a telephone tape recording. Quote, "Your customer dials a number and gets 2 minutes of anti-communist dynamite," unquote. The founder and spark plug of Let Freedom Ring is William C. Douglas, a Sarasota physician, who attacks, among others, Secretary McNamara for opening the country to atomic destruction, the UN for becoming a world military dictatorship, and the PTA for following a socialist or internationalist line.
We started it 4 years ago, almost, because we felt that this was something that very much needed to be done to expose some of the left-wing bias behind many organizations that have actually been considered as conservative organizations, to expose the communist infiltration in many so-called liberal organizations. One example would be the PTA. We had a series of broadcasts on the PTA. We have a series coming up on the League of Women Voters, the mental health movement, the NAACP, the National Council of Churches, to give you a few examples of organizations that we feel the American people do not really understand as well as they should. We don't feel that they basically realize the motivations of many of these organizations. I see this as a vast psychological war. We're in World War III right now. That's a war of the mind, a war of swaying opinions and swaying prejudices, a vast war without any definite boundaries or without any definite fronts. We feel that we are the shock troops on the front lines in this war against the communists, the Psy war.
Having Let Freedom Ring in Sarasota has caused some upset, especially because of the attacks on the PTA. The local PTA responded by creating an Extremism committee. It was to report on whether extremism was a danger to Sarasota and whether Sarasota was getting a bad name because it was mentioned at the end of Douglas's taped messages as the place to write for more information. The meeting was held in the Sarasota Junior High School.
In September 1965, during 2 successive weeks, the National PTA was blasted over the telephone lines as being communistic, that it advocated one world government, federal control of schools, high-handed management from the top, that its members were sheep following blindly, and many other untrue charges. Where did these charges start? Right here in Sarasota, the national headquarters of Let Freedom Ring.
The speaker who caused the biggest commotion was an outsider, an attorney from Orlando named Robert Petrie, a former government lawyer, who was to warn about the dangers of the far right.
Citizens of Sarasota, if you think this battle about the PTA in this county and this city is something just to be shrugged off, you better wake up. It isn't. Your future is in the classrooms of this county, and you better know what's being taught in it. You better know that loyalty to the United States is being taught in it. Loyalty based on understanding of concepts of democracy and individual integrity. Not fear, not suspicion, not hatred. If you're worried about the dollar in Sarasota, merchants, let me tell you something. The gentleman who said that there are just a few here causing this trouble may be right. How many did it take in Nazi Germany to start the trouble? Your image in this state has changed. Sarasota is the city of hate in the eyes of many people in this state. Get up and do something about it. Be heard.
Petrie was an experienced and exciting speaker, and he received some applause and some agreement. But his remarks did not go down well with the Sarasota Board of County Commissioners, which some days later passed a resolution deploring the meeting and saying it gave the nation an unfair, unrepresentative, and damaging picture of the city and county of Sarasota. A member of the local school board, an insurance man named Harry Frazee, also objected.
The meeting, as far as I was concerned, was one where the speaker, Mr. Petrie, certainly did a very dramatic job in the particular type of speech that he delivered, but there was no particular reference to Sarasota County or the school board or pressures which were being brought against the board or by members of the board or against the administration or the teachers. After the meeting, we felt that since charges had been made, which painted Sarasota, by inference at least, as a city of hate and where a lot of extremists were operating, we requested a report, a written report, from the directors of the PTA Council, wherein they would outline any instances they found of extremist pressures either against the board, the administration, or the instructional staff, or in the PTAs and the local groups. Since we did not receive any such instances, we did not have any further meeting with the council, and to date nothing further has been done about this, except we hope that in the future those planning the programs will perhaps screen them a bit better and make them perhaps more relevant to our own local situation here.
But the PTA remains under attack, and the membership in the national organization has dropped by more than 300,000, indicating that the attacks have had some effect. At a meeting in Baltimore, the PTA's national president, Mrs. Janelle Moorhead of Eugene, Oregon, talked about the attacks being made on the organization and what she thought was behind them.
Why the PTA? The PTA is, you see, absolutely basic to the democratic process in this country. And if you could capture the 47,000 local units in our 50 states with, you see, a membership of almost 12 million, you would have a ready-made platform to disseminate a philosophy and an economic viewpoint. And so the PTA was marked for infiltration, subversion, and taking over. Strange as it may seem, I think that it is a little easier to identify and to rout out, let's say, a communist than it is a member of an organization on the far right. The communist represents an outside infiltration from something outside our country. And I know that practically all the people in our country are opposed to this. The infiltration on the right, you see, is a homegrown variety. Many of these people are people who are, shall I say, misguided, who are fearful, terribly afraid of the radical change going on in our lives, so that it is a little more difficult to combat a person who may be misguided but no less dangerous than it is to identify an individual whose purpose is not only to subvert the PTA and democratic organizations, but whose main purpose is to subvert our government.
In the town of Norban, Missouri, is the headquarters of the Minutemen, an extreme right organization arming itself to save the country from its internal enemies. Its head, a chemist named Robert Depew, is under state indictment for possession of bombs. Depew was interviewed by Bill Leeds of NBC News.
Mr. Depew, what is the Minuteman organization?
Well, it's a group of people that are preparing a resistance movement, an anti-communist resistance movement in this country. In perhaps simpler words, a secret underground army. Of course, we believe that our nation, and especially our government even, has been deeply infiltrated by communists and communist sympathizers, and that if this continues at the rate it's going, it's only a matter of time until our nation evolves into a communist socialist police state. Now, the purpose of the organization is to resist this by every means that we can, hopefully by political means and by public education. But if we can't, then we would resort to any means that would be necessary to win back our constitutional republic.
You mean force included?
Yes, that would certainly be involved. We would not hesitate to use any type of armed resistance that we found necessary. Of course, we want to know about these people who are infiltrating and who are subverting our nation. We want to know not only their names, addresses, and phone numbers, but we want to know their means of operation, their travel patterns, their personality, how they control their fellow travelers, and all the means that they are using to try to subvert our political leaders and our industrial leaders and labor leaders, how they've infiltrated the churches, and what means the average citizen has to protect himself against this subversion.
Has this subversion reached a point where you are alarmed?
I think that if it continues at its present rate, our nation will be taken over by the communists by perhaps 1973. That is the deadline they've set for themselves.
Do you think the Minuteman organization can effectively stop this?
I'm not sure that we can. Frankly, I feel pessimistic about the situation. The communists have been at their work very cleverly and very systematically for 45 or 50 years. I think that we're making rapid progress, but they had a big head start on us.
What is your opinion of our Vietnam policy?
I can't go along with the government's position in Vietnam at all. This war that we have over there is simply draining the arms and the military potential that we should be using elsewhere. It doesn't make sense at all to combat communism 10,000 miles from home and ignore the threat in Cuba or ignore the threat in Washington, D.C.
Near Depew's business office, there is a wooden frame house on a quiet street. It houses the Minutemen files, lists of people considered dangerous, and it stores the Minutemen literature, such as the pamphlet Blueprint for Victory, which says that for the true American patriot, there are only two alternatives today: victory over communism or death. In Boston, the Reverend Dr. Carl McIntyre picketed a Presbyterian conclave objecting to increasing modernism in the church. This trend, he contends, plays into the hands of the communists. McIntyre's views are carried on more than 600 radio stations, which costs money. One of his associates, Dr. Donald Waite, conducts radio rallies to raise funds, this one in Dover, Delaware. The theme, a McIntyre favorite.
The hard core of the National Council of Churches and the Federal Council preceding it is a conspiracy. A conspiracy. And a conspiracy must work in the darkness. A conspiracy must work in the blackness of night and cannot stand to be exposed. We gave you, for example, the entire compilation of public records of some 658 clergymen and laymen connected with the National Council of Churches, put out by the circuit riders, 110 Government Place, Cincinnati 2, Ohio, by Mr. M.G. Lohman. Now, these are public records, and this printed in 1962, April. We told of the various Communist Front affiliations of these various gentlemen. I would just cite the fact that 30 of the 95 translators on the committee of the Revised Standard Version, again by a pamphlet and a compilation of public records put out by the circuit riders in Cincinnati, Ohio, read it and see 30 of the 95 translators of the Revised Standard Version of the Bible, copy of which I have up here. 30 of the 95 of these who translated this book have leftist or pro-communist or socialist or communist front affiliations. Ladies and gentlemen, inasmuch as a Communist Front organization is a front organization which is controlled by the international gangster criminal communist conspiracy, inasmuch as it's under the control of our enemy, which is sworn to bury us, those ministers of the National Council of Churches and those laymen of the National Council of Churches who have affiliated and aligned themselves with these Communist Front groups, in my judgment, are committing treason against the United States because they are willingly aiding and abetting, or they have in the past aided and abetted our enemy.
Extremists are not without their opponents. One such is Gordon Hall of Boston. He has been beaten up. He receives threatening calls and letters. Robert Welch, in the Blue Book of the John Birch Society, devotes 5 pages to him, most of it a primer on how to silence Hall. Hall offers to help anyone who needs it, the FBI, the police, political parties, the press, and in this case, a young man who became disillusioned with the Birch Society, quit, and wanted to know how to fight it. Hall lives on the 125 lectures he does each year. He once joined the extremist organizations himself to get information, but fame caught up with him. He's had to turn over the spying to volunteers less easily recognized. Among the few citizens groups dedicated to exposing extremism are various committees for civic responsibility. These are independent committees tackling extremism on budgets that are low in time and money. Civic leaders in the Baltimore area, convinced that extremists were instrumental in defeating urban renewal and open occupancy, started a committee. The keynoter at their first meeting was Democratic Senator Gail McGee of Wyoming.
I think it's well to understand that when we're talking about extremism, and we can't emphasize it too much, that we're talking about a form, a tactic, methodology, regardless of the direction it comes from. That extremism of the left is still as dastardly as extremism of the right. The suggestion has been made too frequently, and particularly in some of the columns in the press, that because of the election of 1964, the back of the extremists was broken. May I suggest to you with all humility that the back was not broken. It enabled them to put their pieces together, and they're with it now in ways that they were not before. You see, you and I, whom I describe as the good guys, are really as much at fault in all this as the bad guys. Take the issues, they talk about them, and you talk about them in constructive terms. And just because you disagree with a guy down the street, please don't call him a communist. Don't call him a fascist. Don't tell him he's a bircher. Take his idea and wrestle with him over the substance of that idea. Let's practice what we preach and not yield to this very tempting prospect of joining the skunks.
This could be a scene from a grade B movie, but the man in the convertible is not acting. He is George Lincoln Rockwell, Führer of the American Nazi Party. The principles are those of the German Nazis: racism, anti-Semitism, and Aryan supremacy. As commander, Rockwell demands absolute obedience from his majors, captains, lieutenants, and of course, stormtroopers. There is no exact membership figure available. Highest estimates are a few hundred. Arlington, Virginia is headquarters, but Rockwell gets around, picketing Zionist, liberal, and civil rights groups. Rockwell chose Memorial Day and his home state of Maine for this display, honoring the fighting dead of the United States, but limiting it in his own way.
Well, this, gentlemen, is in honor of the American fighting men and the white Christian fighting men all over the world that I have seen give their lives, have given their lives, fighting for our country. And in a demonstration against the peace creeps and the traitors who are supporting the Viet Cong communists. All right, here we go.
Some people feel publicity helps Rockwell and he should be ignored. Others get violent. Still others find their own ways of registering disapproval. The Ku Klux Klan has been around since post-Civil War days. Its peak came in 1924 with 4 million members. That later dwindled to next to nothing, but today the roster has risen into the thousands, the increase being related to one of the Klan's bitterest hates, civil rights. Last October, the House Un-American Activities Committee, often criticized for concentrating on the left, took off on the KKK. After weeks of hearings, the House voted to cite Imperial Wizard Robert Shelton Jr. and 6 other Klan leaders. One of the most intent enemies of the Klan on the committee is Congressman Charles Weltner of Georgia, who helped to trigger the hearings. He talked with Herbert Kaplow.
Congressman, how does the committee define an extremist organization?
We, of course, have no formal definition of extremist organization. Our rules provide us with the duty of inquiring into the scope, character, and extent of un-American activities in the United States. Now, recently, that inquiry has been shifted from what was before exclusively investigation into communist activities to include organizations such as the Ku Klux Klan. I would define un-American activities as included in the rules of the House to encompass activities which use or advocate force and violence to deprive citizens of rights guaranteed them by the Constitution. Now, that could either be to deprive them of the collective right to a republican form of government by the forcible overthrow of the United States, such as advocated by the Communist Party, or it could be the individual deprivation of rights, such as the right to vote, the right of free speech, and the right of freedom of assembly, as advocated and employed by organizations such as the Ku Klux Klan. But I think we have to tie it to activities and to action and not broaden the matter to include some political viewpoint or some social outlook.
Do you feel that the word un-American is synonymous with extremist in the context we're discussing?
No, I don't think so. If the term un-American is limited to activities, I think you could certainly have extremist viewpoints. And there should be a clear line, though, as to what activities the House Committee on Un-American Activities can rightfully inquire into. And on the other side of that line, the viewpoints or philosophies or doctrines that many groups that we call extremist have in this country. For instance, the political outlook of the John Birch Society is quite similar to that of the Ku Klux Klan, but as yet the John Birch Society has not engaged in criminal activity and has not advocated or used force of violence to deprive citizens of their rights. And so long as their views are restricted to views only, and so long as their views are not sought to be imposed upon others by force and violence, that would be beyond the jurisdiction of any committee of the United States Congress. At least that's my view of the matter.
Mr. Weltner, what legislation is being thought about in this area?
Well, I have a bill that tries to deal with criminal conspiracies without naming any group, without proscribing any particular group. The essence of my bill is that a criminal conspiracy defined in one instance as a group that uses or advocates force and violence to deprive citizens of the free exercise of rights guaranteed them by the Constitution and the laws of the United States.
I'd like to add a few points. There have always been groups in this country that see the world in conspiratorial terms, with themselves as the only people who can save the country from those conspiracies, and that will certainly continue. Second, the existence of fringe groups is normal and is accepted in every country with free political institutions. And it is obviously better that political argument be kept as wide open as possible. Good ideas can come from the wings as well as from the center. Finally, not everybody who is an extremist or a crank or even a villain today necessarily will be an extremist or a crank or a villain tomorrow. Especially on the left, people go in and out of radical groups as though through a revolving door. It is not wise to stigmatize people for a lifetime for views that may be held in the most transitory way. Well, we don't pretend that we've spoken the last word on the outer fringe. We couldn't if we wanted to. In politics, which is the means by which man governs himself, there is no last word. Edwin Newman, NBC News.